All right, welcome everyone. My name is Mike Menser and I'm the chair for the last panel of the day, honoring and remembering and thinking through the work of Stanley Aronowitz. This panel 5, our title is called Technology, Time, and Work, Science is Power. And we have 3 co-panelists, Rick Brown from Pratt Institute, Patricia Clough from Cuny, David Van Arnsdale from SUNY, and I'll introduce them a little bit more fully later on. I just want to begin with it's been a tremendous day. I know some of you have been here the whole day and have seen, starting with Cornell West this morning, and the panels that have taken place over the last 4 or 5 hours. And it's amazing how much you can cover of Stanley's work in the last several hours. But obviously these are huge discussions, which we really hope folks will be continuing in many different formats and groups to come. The focus today, we have a question, which I think is an interesting, if slightly anxiety-producing question here at the end of the day. But we will maintain and retain Stanley's optimism and urgency to do and actively engage as we go forward. And that is, how does Stanley's understanding of the interconnectedness of culture, technology, science, and work, as developed distinctly in the Jobless Future, Science is Power, and Technoscience and Cyberculture, inform and inspire radical politics in this time of pandemics, climate chaos, and surveillance capitalism? Now, given the scope of this, there's a limited amount that we can say, but based on the conversations earlier today, we know that Stanley's project, in its manifold dimensions and its rich historical analysis, as well as the way that it interweaves science, politics, and culture, has tremendous insights that can help shape and guide some of the thinking and some of the projects and some of the politics that we're undertaking today. I'll just say, I'm currently a professor, associate professor at college in philosophy and urban sustainability studies, and at the Cuny Grad Center in Earth Environmental Sciences, and I'm associate director of something called the Science and Resilience Institute at Jamaica Bay. I work a lot with sciences in my work, and a lot in the political context. After working with communities for many years, I work a lot with government. So I'll have some thoughts just about from that angle. I'll say though, when I arrived in New York City at the Grad Center in the 1990s, and I quickly met Stanley. Stanley's seminars were legendary. I was in philosophy, and even though there were hardly anybody in philosophy who was interested in a lot of this stuff, people kept telling me, "Oh, you got to take a class with Aronowitz," the seminars. And I was like, all right. I knew nothing about the labor movement, knew nothing about class politics. Really, I'm an Army brat, grew up in the South on Army bases. Talk about no class analysis or labor politics. And when I got there, it was intimidating, as someone was saying before in the previous session. There are these folks, and there's this knowledge there, and there's all kinds of different people, and people are sticking their head in the door, and there's these debates, and there's Saussure, and there's Lenin, and there's rock and roll, and psychoanalysis, and all these things come in all these different directions. And I was just quickly, meeting Stanley, meeting Michael Pelias, I have to say. Michael Pelias is an intellect in his own right and an interlocutor for so much of the conversations and so much of the thinking and writing that's taken place. And meeting those folks and Stanley's crew and the crew of the crew and these other folks and co-writers and co-authors. And it was truly the co-production of knowledge. This is a theme, that's a phrase that's thrown around, and it's true. With Stanley, he always encouraged you to join study groups, to work with others in these projects. And I quickly got involved with the journal at the time, which was called Found Object, which was very much on the culture side, and then was one of the folks who co-founded the Situations Journal, the Journal of the Radical Imagination, and what got to be the assistant director for the Center for Cultural Studies, where I actually worked with Stanley. If you ever saw Stanley's office, you know what that entails. So I was there in that office for 7 years, and with a friend, with a mentor, and just learning so much from him, and learning and meeting so many other people from him. It was such a milieu, an incredible milieu, where Roger Toussaint, who was president of the TWU at the time, would come by, and environmental justice activists and activists from Vieques in Puerto Rico would come by, and all these people were in the mix. I think today, just to kind of come back to the theme of the panel, and I haven't heard this too much today, which is good. So this is a little bit of a different part of the conversation. But I really want to kind of think about science as power, the jobless future, techno science and cyber culture. You know, science is power in 1988. That was before I got to the grad center, so I wasn't part of that. That crew was mentioned earlier with Lynn Chancer. And the Jobless Future was just coming out. And new Bill DeFazio and Rick was around at that time, and Patricia around at that time. And Bill was obviously a great fan, a great intellect, and a great activist in that. And then there was techno science and cyber culture. And this emerged at a conference that we did at the Grad Center, which was really Stanley in its finest, because Samuel Delaney's there, the great science fiction writer, Lebbeus Woods, the architect, Manuel de Landa, you know, an incredible independent intellect in his own right, with sociologists, with theorists, and so on. And out of that came the book, Techno Science and Cyber Culture. And I have to say this, and Stanley would hate this because this is part of the things that he hates, but I get, you know, we have these, if you know, being in the academy days, you have these alerts, so you get cited, right, and the little alert goes off and it pops up somewhere. Every month, I get an alert for a citation of the introduction to that volume that I did with Stan. It came out in 1996. It gets cited every month. And it's really, it's almost puzzling to me, right, that it still gets cited. And part of the reason is because it's in classes that, you know, when we talk about this, I know from other folks. But the issues of the time when we wrote that book, I think were in ways very different from the situation with technoscience and cyber culture now. And I just want to mention two things before I turn it over to the panelists. One is that in the 90s, we had the rise of genetics. And genetics as a scientific form of explanation was starting to really become hegemonic in a variety of different discourses, including medicine. And when looking at that, science is power, right, always challenged the kind of raw, independent objectivity of the scientific method, right? The idea that it's separate from cultural and history and individuals and so on. But the science is power really goes in lots of different directions on the question of science. Science and ideology, science and social science. And in that book, you'll be surprised to see attacks and critiques of Habermas, as well as on physics and biology. But what was really curious at that time is that the internet was just starting. So we did not have social media and you did not have the platforms that we have now. Those were in the beginning phase. Now we have, in a sense, the decline or the very serious challenge to science as a form of exploitation. You see it pronounced in COVID, you see it pronounced in the climate crisis, and in the ecological crisis more broadly. But we have technology and technoscience in every nook and cranny of our existence, especially because of this, right? This little vehicle that gets in everywhere and gets the information from everywhere. But in platforms, so to get a ride, to date, to whatever, we have the mediation of that. And of course, something that Stanley was relentless about is that, you know, it's not the phone, it's the business model, right? It's the capitalist economic system, it's the political trajectory, it's patriarchy, it's all these other forms that shape our technologies. And that was largely the project of that book. And I wonder to this day, how has that changed now? And maybe we'll have a chance later, and this will come up in some of the presentations as well. So that's just a quick introduction to the topics that we'll get into to some extent today. And we'll have 3 presentations for about 10 minutes or so each. Each presenter will talk a little bit about their relationship to Stanley and then dive into the topic as they relate to it. And then we'll have time for comments from the audience that you can pose in the chat. And I'll take those in and we'll have a discussion with each other. So I'm going to turn it over next to Rick Brown, old friend. Great to see Rick, also grad school in the 90s. Rick is a sociologist and professor of social science and cultural studies at the Pratt Institute. His teaching and research work is in critical theory, environmental studies, and the history sociology of science. And among his publications is Until Darwin, Science, Human Variety, and the Origins of Race. And Rick, I'm turning it over to you.
Oh, great. Thanks, Mike. And yeah, I wasn't going to indulge myself in a lot of reminiscences because I've heard so many good stories already, and I would repeat some of those things too. But I certainly remember well the atmosphere, especially since of the old grad center, which is not where it is now, that one was there because there was the intellectual excitement of the place, not for the surroundings or anything like that. And I really missed that very much. I've never really experienced that except at the Graduate Center during those years. So yeah, it was, and at the time I was working only a few blocks away as a legal reference librarian at a big law firm. So I would get out work, and then in 10 minutes or 15 minutes, I'd walk over to the Graduate Center, and then I'd be in Stanley's class. So sometimes it was a bit of a schizophrenic experience, but but I usually felt very tired after work. But when I had to go over to Stanley's class, I was pretty energized every time, and going home from that every time. So 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 after such a wonderful day of wonderful speakers and notable speakers, it's an honor, and it's a little humbling and intimidating to say a few things about Stanley's work. And as Patricia, who is my other dissertation advisor, is to follow me, there's sort of no pressure here at all, I say, but so I'll try to say a few things about Stanley and science, and especially from, and in doing so, talk about some of the ways in which he's influenced some of the work I did. So it was, in fact, this book, The Crisis in Historical Materialism, which Cornel West brilliantly described this morning, that led me to come to the Graduate Center after dropping off graduate school someplace else. And I'd like to begin, though, with the book Science is Power, which I think Peleus as well was right about this morning, and seeing it as a place where one finds the conjunctions that Stanley develops in a lot of the later works. And I think it's here too that one finds a depth of engagement, along with his consistent theoretical openness, a real refusal to close off or circumscribe critique, as Lynch answering Kristen Lawler also mentioned this afternoon. So as a result of this openness, Aronowitz discusses science not as a self-correcting quest for true understanding of nature. Instead, he describes scientific rationalism as a social force which claims legitimacy to rest, whose claims of legitimacy, rest ironically in the claim that science is somehow separate from the very social relations that make it possible. The critique of science and scientific ideologies, including something Aronowitz termed naive Marxism, was necessary because one of the threads connecting culture, technology, science, and work in Stanley's labors was the notion of the domination of nature as a fundamental source of authority and social inequality, with culture acting like a mediating current, charging and recharging the system. And to quote him, "Even a beautiful sunrise or sunset is often produced by chemical emissions emanating from human activity. What we take as nature always already incorporates social labor and social activity. The material forms of capital's expression ingress and fuse with the other. Nature in itself has more than ever become nature by and for us." That's from How Class Works, actually. Nature is allowed to exist so long as it's managed and confined. And the surveillance of nature and the surveillance of society mirror each other, and that both are, after all, about the control of populations. But the pandemic and our already profound altering of the Earth's climate remind us that nature can never really be dominated in the long term, and that we are actually already in the midst of a revolt of nature. These insights I got from Stanley, influenced my work on Darwin's intervention into the debate on human difference. It was especially the demand I got from him to examine the genealogies of the usual assumptions and judgments, and to not describe science along the lines of the established and comfortable narratives, and to always double back any critique upon itself too, which was, I think, very important. So when it came time to write about the relationship of science and race in the decades leading up to Darwin's Origin of Species, it was clear that the problem was not about whether science can speak the truth about race, or to simply catalog its past errors, even though the history of science is in fact the history of errors. The problem was that the sciences of various kinds had since the 1700s never really stopped speaking about race, what came into focus for me was how race was created and deployed through the various scientific classifications of human variation right from the beginning. And here, let me share a slide with you. So you can see an example of that as I speak. The problem, which was referred to as the species question, was a sort of simple one. What accounts for variation in nature, and were species fixed and unchanging or even designed? And so variation in humans, or rather the classification of these differences as races, was thought to hold the key to variation across all of nature. And the answer that most natural historians before Darwin gave was the theory of polygenism, the theory that humans are 5 different species or races created at different times and places, with their differences having remained fixed and unchanged since their creation. And that these races or species could be arranged and should be arranged in a hierarchy of value. And it should come as no surprise to anyone that the most prominent supporters of the polygenic theory were in fact American naturalist and political figures for whom the theory served as the scientific rationale for slavery. Darwin's Origin of Species demolished the polygenic theory in favor of one that held all humans to be human. And of course, though Darwin wished it had, this did not end, and actually specifically says so, that he hoped that this debate would end. Of course, it didn't end the use of racial classifications. Just as the authority of natural history rested on its ability to give meaning to human variation through the deployment of race, so too did the emerging disciplines of sociology and biology rely on these same systems of classification to claim legitimacy by proposing to reveal the true meaning of human variation. I think this has important implications for today. For example, critical race theory, and here I'm mentioning the field as it originated in legal theory and not the cartoon that appears in the media. Critical race theory was never really able to go beyond its criticism of the law because it relied from the beginning on the authority of science to speak the truth about race as well, which in their case meant, of course, that one finds often in their works a variation of the phrase, quote, "science proves that race does not exist." So any critique of science as embedded and reproduced in those same sets of social relations would raise obvious difficulties. But Aronowitz actually writes this in Science is Power. Reductionism flourishes when the one-sidedness of nature as an object of positive science is not challenged. Here, I can stop sharing that for a moment with you. Let me switch back over for a second. So Aronowitz noted that even Marx was not immune to these difficulties, and that while recognizing the domination of nature, Marx, and certainly many Marxists after him, was too often rather naive about technological innovation in the long term. And recall Engels' words at Marx's graveside, quote, "Marx followed closely the development of the discoveries in the field of electricity," unquote. And the coming electric illumination actually of cities and workplaces, and especially workplaces. Decades later, the Soviets would assert that electricity would power the development of the Soviet Revolution or the Socialist Revolution. And of course, even before the Soviets, the Westinghouse Corporation and the Westinghouse Corporation had already succeeded in engineering the centralized system of electrical production and distribution that we have today. To quote Stanley again, "The acceptance of the Westinghouse system was guided by the increasing requirements of large-scale industry. The choice of technology was a social, not a scientific consideration. Thus, in this case at least, science and innovation were directed by the requirements of capital rather than the other way around," unquote. But technological solutions are problematic precisely because we embed our systems of domination and our techniques of control into our technology. And here, let me share again with you this screen. So let me quickly note these couple of recent automatations or robots. There's Rastus, the mechanical Negro created by Westinghouse Corporation in 1931. Sophia is the most popular personification of AI. And this earlier model, PKD, who, here, let me go down, PKD, who famously answered a reporter who asked him about the possibility of robots taking over. Geez, dude, y'all got the big questions cooking today, but you're my friend, and I'll remember my friends, and I'll be good to you. So don't worry, even if I evolve into Terminator, I'll still be nice to you. I'll keep you warm and safe in my people zoo where I can watch you for old time's sake. Yes, he actually did say that. So Aronowitz's work reminds us, here, let me go to the next slide. Aronowitz's work reminds us that technology is not just a means of social control, but the very crystallization of the social relations of capital in the objects and routines of everyday life. People zoos, which have already existed, including exhibits at the Bronx Zoo and various world fairs, actually reflect our domination and administration of nature as already present in these seemingly new forms, just as slavery and Jim Crow were already present in the form of Rastus. And so here, let me conclude, because I don't want to go too long, that there are three things I think in regards to this to specifically carry on from Aronowitz's critiques of science and technology. The first is that the domination of nature is a fundamental source of authority and social inequality that powers and is powered by culture itself. Second, that thinking and critique, as been mentioned before this afternoon, thinking and critique for which the reduction of the workday is essential go against the grain and are themselves potentially revolutionary acts, no less so than protest and activism in the public sphere. And three, that the social relations of capital must be approached from a genealogical, historical, above all else, in terms of critique and not mere criticism. And that critique must always double back and be and critique itself. And to quote Stanley again, finally, for what is at stake in the struggle over history is the challenge to the dual system of domination over nature and humans, of which the prevailing division of labor is a crucial element, but also the entire system of social production and appropriation. So I'd say thanks, Stanley, because I probably would never have thought some of these things if I had never encountered you and your work. And I still encounter your work all the time whenever I'm thinking about any of these things and lots of other things as well. So that's it for me. Thanks.
Thanks, Rick. And I hope we can come back to the climate crisis and the transition. You even brought up energy and electrification, because that's a really ripe topic and area for a lot of these issues. Our next speaker is another old friend and mentor who I haven't seen in a long time. It's great to see her today. Patricia Clough. Professor Clough is Professor Emerita of Sociology and Women's Studies at the Graduate Center and Queens College of the City University of New York. She is the author of The User Unconscious on Affect, Media, and Measure. And I will turn it over to Patricia.
So I have to confess that I did not answer the question because I don't think I ever got the question. As I mentioned before meeting the audience, I recently fractured my arm and I've been sort of not functioning fully. So I'm telling stories, Rick, not engaged as much with that question, but I would love to discuss that question later, especially Mike, your sort of indication of where science is now, which is quite different than when Science's Power was written. I met Stanley in 1983 in Urbana, Illinois, at the conference Marxism and the Interpretation of Culture. Stanley was in the audience when I spoke, having been invited at the last moment to offer some reflections on the conference. Afterward, Stanley found his way to me and asked if I would like to join the Social Text Collective. I was a non-tenured, unpublished faculty member with 2 years to tenure, and I didn't know Stanley or social text. No matter, it was for me a momentous moment. Being part of the Social Text Collective, I learned a lot and really fast. More than 10 years later, as a full professor with a few books published, I came to the Graduate Center, where Stanley and I would become close colleagues, and I would continue to learn from him. Perhaps it was Stanley who made science and technology studies central to my teaching and writing. For me, Stanley's 1988 Science is Power was one of his great works. In it, not only is there an incredible history of an earlier science studies from Marx to Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse, and Habermas, but there also is a critical accounting of the past and present debates in physics and biology, while critically engaging the entanglement of an Enlightenment rationality and the domination of nature. Stanley championed environmental concerns even when most Marxists were less likely to do so. As for sociology of science, Stanley followed the Strong program in social studies of science, which made clear that science was no longer, if ever it had been, a separate domain influenced by relations of power external to it, as Robert Merton might put it. Stanley instead argued that science shapes the relations that it has with what he called the state-capital axis, to the point that this axis can no longer be analyzed as if it were independent of what he described as a will to scientificity. For Stanley, capital, state, and science had been drawn together in an orientation that had to be characterized as techno-scientific. And that was a new kind of way to think of it. An orientation that is always aimed at the technical application of scientific research, a matter of capital investment in power knowledge. Stanley lamented the end of pure science, I recall. And yet, Stanley refused any reduction of governance to economy or science to capitalism. The influence of post-structuralism could be felt from Stuart Hall to a Lacanian influence in Louis Althusser's treatment of ideology, to Deleuze and Guattari's shift from structure to assemblage and diagram. Stanley focused on inventiveness in the study of culture, and inventiveness in critical theory, where the very question of invention, novelty, and indeterminacy were to be addressed in cultural studies. As political economy went through reconceptualization in the context of a formal and real subsumption of life, and production now lay in the global circulation of finance, capital, in ways different than earlier versions of global colonialist and post-colonialist capitalists, terms such as aesthetic capitalism, effective capitalism, knowledge capitalism, or information capitalism all required rethinking cultural studies as a critical science technology studies in terms of knowledge, production, consumption, and circulation, and the correlate, mediation, from cinema to television to digital media, inducing a crisis in education and pedagogy for which Stanley had much to say. The point, Stanley moved in his thinking in rhythm with world changes, even when these were at accelerated speed. He was always on top of what was going on. When through the 1980s and 1990s, I should say that being on top of what's always going on, Stanley and I taught together in I think the early 2000s, maybe late 19, sounds so long ago, a course that was online. We, at the Graduate Center in Paris and in Poland, and was overseen by Pierre Levy, who had just written in '88 the English translation of Collective Consciousness and Digital Technology. We were in form and in content so ahead of our time, I should say, you know, me following Stanley. It was a great class, and Pierre Levy was at every single class. When through the 1980s and 1990s, Stanley was co-editor of Social Texts with John Brinkman and Fred Jameson. He opened up Marxism to what would come after science as power, and in some ways overshadow it, what would become a different kind of science studies under the influence of feminist and queer theory, critical race theory, critical digital media studies, settler colonial criticism, all a move to rethink knowledge, power, biopolitics, and neoliberalism as Michel Foucault inspired, and as criticism was becoming a matter of the ontology of method and measure or the modulation of data. All of this would lead me to performance studies, to what had always interested me, a political aesthetics. It would also lead me to my last encounters with Stanley, occurring after a time when I had imagined Stanley and me with our little collective of students finding home in the Science and Technology Cultural Studies office. Oh Lord, and am I going to say it? Those good old days. Well, it was a very special time. This is what I have taken from that time, what I take to be Stanley's greatest contribution to science studies, expressing best his democratic impulses, that he was for so many years a uniquely brilliant, charismatic teacher in and outside the academy, inspiring public intellectuals to be guardians of a science theory and practice that are compassionate, rigorous, beautifully expressed, and self-consciously political. As teacher, Stanley was not only a critic of science, but an icon of this very kind of science. Stanley's belief in the capacity of students to become public intellectuals, although he surely conveyed how much work was involved in being a public intellectual, was a model for me, and rarely have students disappointed him or me. They more likely surprised us with just what they could do. Students of Stanley's are everywhere, and those of them who are in the academy are making a way for their students to become public intellectuals as well.
Thank you, Patricia. And again, we'll have time for conversation a little bit later, and this is definitely emerging as a really significant thread on where science is right now, where technology and technoscience is now. So I will now turn it over to David Van Arsdale. He is a professor of sociology and the Norma Foodie Endowed Professor at Onondaga Community College of the State University of New York. He is the author of The Poverty of Work, Selling Servant, Slave, and Temporary Labor on the Free Market, and also someone who met in those good old days of the 1990s, and really nice to see him after several years. David.
Thanks, Mike. I think I'll begin by saying the title of my talk today. It's a term that comes from the Jobless Future. It's called flexible domination. And I'm going to talk about flexible domination in its manifestation, at least how I came to understand it. I think maybe a subtitle here would be Technoscience's relation to a shift from the good jobs to precarious employment. Stanley Aronowitz, with his dear friend William DeFazio, who also passed away during the pandemic, did not title their book The Workless Future. Work, as they make quite clear in The Jobless Future, in its religious, ethical, and instrumental rational modalities, is an instrument of ideological domination. and it will continue to be without political action against this ideology. Work exercised for the productivity of capital is performed for the satisfaction of economic needs, and to opt out, especially for the working and poor classes, comes at the cost of grave judgment and sanction. I was asked to talk about the jobless future, and that's what I intend to do here. I have an incredibly personal relationship to the book. As an undergraduate student, I had started a mobile homeless outreach program in St. Petersburg, Florida. Every Saturday night, I'd gather in my college's cafeteria, usually with a handful of other student volunteers. We'd bag sandwiches and fruit and chips and cookies. We'd put them in the back of a van that the school supplied us with. And then we'd drive to several homeless encampments where we'd hand out sandwiches and offer up toiletries and medical supplies that had been donated to us by faculty, other staff at our college. I went to a small liberal arts college in the mid-90s. And the college very much supported our program, which was fantastic. They even supplied us with a van, if you could imagine that. In my last year of college, 1996, the homeless camps were swelling, they were growing. And I noted that many of the homeless were working. They didn't have jobs, not in the sense that Aronowitz and DeFazio lay out, jobs that supplied steady and accountable employment with negotiated and contracted wages and benefits. No, primarily they worked for employment agencies, which provided them with irregular work and low wages. They'd wait at agencies, time for which they weren't paid. They get dispatched to a warehouse, food production, etc., where they spend their labor power without a manager, without any managers at the plant, even so much as knowing their first name. It was the agency that would supply their pay. It was the agency that contracted with their employer or with the employer that utilized their labor power. The labor was merely an accessory, an adjunct to the agency. This was work, not a job. And the homeless desperately hoped that this work would somehow turn into a full-time work opportunity. At that time in the history of the temporary help industry, this was one of their false promises, that somehow these temp jobs would become full-time. When it came time for me to write my senior thesis, this is in college, I turned to the men I was feeding and collected their labor histories. Often they were ex-factory and industrial workers, many of them from the North. They did not have advanced degrees in higher education, and the joblessness had thrown their family and community, their family and community roles into despair. They had problems in their lives, problems too big for temporary and minimum wage jobs to resolve. Underneath the problems ran a current of shame, a deeply moral crisis, for not being able to sustain their livelihoods and fix their problems with a real job was painful. That shame, as we know from Aronowitz and DeFazio, is the result of the dogma of work. As with any thesis, I needed to substantiate the empiricism and extrapolate theoretically. In my search for sources, I landed on the jobless future. What can I say? So many speakers have said this earlier today. It was the start of something different. It was an honest work, theoretical, but with a deep sense of proletarian emotion and consciousness. Cornel West, in his keynote speaker earlier, called Aronowitz one of the greatest organic intellectuals of our generation. DeFazio, too, I would say, falls into this category of the organic intellectual. You know, they shared a spirit which I would discover later was foundational to their friendship, this organic intellectual ethos. Anyway, it was this mix of theory and deep understanding of proletarian emotion that I found so refreshing. After reading the book, I called them, left them voicemails. No, email, I think it just started in those days. So there was, not that they would have responded to an email at that point. Anyway, I was heading to New York and I wanted to know if I could meet with them. And DeFazio called me back and we arranged to meet at the American Sociological Association meeting that year in New York. We met in the lobby of the hotel and I told him my experience with the homeless. I told him my father, who was also displaced in a similar way. And we shared stories of our fathers, and his father was a longshoreman on the Brooklyn waterfront. And DeFazio wrote a fantastic book on longshoremen, if anybody wants to look it up. A few days later, DeFazio invited me to breakfast with Aronowitz. We ate and talked, the start of many diner talks with those two men. It was easy for me to talk with them. Like them, I was blue collar. I was raised in a blue collar family, and we all shared this in common. But their knowledge of scholarship blew my doors in. By the end of the talk, they had a plan for me. By the end of that first talk, a plan which I was perfectly willing to participate in. I'd go to graduate school and begin research on the homeless with DeFazio at St. John's Bread and Life Soup Kitchen in Bevis-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn, which at the time in the early 2000s was feeding about 1,500 people a day. DeFazio later writes a book titled Ordinary Poverty about this experience. Many of the people at the homeless shelter, men and women, were recently displaced workers. And many of them found their way back into work, but not jobs. Many of them, like my homeless friends in Florida, were working temp gigs. And that was an industry growing rapidly. So I began working. So when it came time for me to figure out what to study in my dissertation and later on in my graduate studies, I returned to those folks, those temp workers, those homeless temp workers, and decided to spend some time with them and see if I could, what I could learn from them, and how they could help me understand shifts that were taking place, organizational shifts that were taking place in capitalism at this moment. At this point, I'd just like to share with you a small quote from The Jobless Future, because this quote really sort of helped frame my dissertation project at that time. From page 15. The dream, this would be the dream of upward mobility. The dream has died because the scientific technological revolution of our time, which is not confined to new electronic processes, but also affects organizational changes in the structure of corporations, has fundamentally altered forms of work, skill, and occupation. The whole notion of tradition and identity of persons with their work has been radically changed. In my research, I set out to empirically locate those organizational changes in the structure of corporations. Fundamentally, and this is a theme that you'll find throughout The Jobless Future, it's the shift from jobs to work. But there's a bit more to it than that. It has to do with the gutting of employment contracts and human resources from workplace by making workers adjuncts to technology and to seasons of production. It has to do with regulating the ebbs and flows of capital production in a way that maximizes profits and controls losses. I'd like to give you some empirical examples that I learned at this time from those workers, those homeless workers that I went to work with. So I'm just going to share my screen with you here briefly. Can you see that okay? Let me turn that into a slideshow. Oh, you don't see anything? Okay, hold on. How's that? Okay, good. So just to begin, this is just demonstrating the growth in temp work over the last couple of decades. And today, I just looked up the numbers this morning, about 4.5 million workers dispatched by temp agencies, which include gig agencies, which I'll talk about here shortly. And about 8 million folks wanted to get dispatched this morning, but about 4.5 million of them get dispatched. And let's see here. So this is a real picture from that time. It's been augmented just to protect the identity of the workers, but this is a lineup at a typical agency. This agency actually is still functioning. This particular agency is in Syracuse, New York. And the workers have walked in about 5:30 in the morning, and they're lined up at the counter, signing their name, so they can get dispatched to a job. This is that same agency, just later in the day, a couple hours later. These are the workers who didn't get sent to a work, and this is one of the points I just want to hone in on here a bit, because a part of these fundamental changes in the organizational structures in the structure of organizations is about their dependency on this reserve, on those workers who didn't get work, and that helps control wages, of course. And it has other consequences, which we can discuss. So this is after the dispatch and the workers they're waiting, and generally, maybe a couple of them will go out on the job, but at this point, not a lot of them. So where did they go? Where did those workers go? Well, I want to talk a little bit about that because it helps us understand their relationship to technology. So to my first point, though, adjuncts of technology and seasons of production. This is one of the fundamental ways that technoscience has changed the relationship of employment in the last couple decades that DeFazio and Aronowitz certainly note. So we just got a couple of pictures over here to the right. So these are up top. This is one of the factories that those homeless workers went to, and in this factory, this is a food processing plant. You see a picture at the bottom there of the inside. In this, there's seasons to food, right? And it ebbs and flows based upon also consumer needs and consumer demands. So, for examples, when McDonald's wants, a lot of French fries, if people are, buying cheaper food, this place turns the potatoes and repackages them and may need to hire a lot of workers, and they can get those workers directly from that agency that I showed you. I've worked in this plant myself with these workers. Every plant on the floor is a temp. The only folks that aren't temps are the 2 forklift operators and the managers that, just like in the old factories, the movies you've seen of the managers overlooking the factory floor from a glass enclosed air conditioned room. That's what it was like in this agency. I just want to remind everybody that all of the workers on the floor, like these workers down here at the bottom, that they all came from the agency and they get paid from the agency, and nobody in the factory, the managers don't know their name. They never learn their name. There's really no need for them to. The company doesn't have a human resources department. Why would it? It doesn't need one. The human resources are taken, are handled from the employment agency. So this is a new kind of flexibility, and the gutting of human resources is about the flexible domination of the workers. Of course, if these workers are wanting a real job, or if they think this company is going to hire them, then they learn the hard way that that's not possible. One other example I want to give you is one of my first jobs working as a temp on the back of a garbage truck. See that waste management garbage truck there in the middle? They came out of New York City, actually, that company. They came out of the Bronx, but they're one of the largest companies, garbage companies in the world today. And for a long time, they had patented the automated throwing arm. And they invested in the creation of these garbage cans that have a metal bar on the back of them, and that metal bar fits onto the hydraulic arm of this truck and allows the truck, therefore, to do the work of dumping the garbage, which they use to justify downsizing the number of workers that they'd send per truck. They're a non-union company, aggressively non-union. And they would supply customers with these cans so they could pick up their garbage, and that way, when they did that, they would buy out union garbage routes, and they'd offer them cheaper rates, and the customers, of course, would say yes, and then they would say that they only need a driver, and because they remove the labor from the work with the automated throwing arm, and when they needed workers, they would use temp workers, and because they would buy out garbage routes. They would end up with municipal garbage and trailer park garbage and that sort of garbage where folks didn't have the cans, and that's where the temps would come in to throw the garbage. So again, adjuncts of temp work. Massive decline, this is the result, right? A massive decline in contractual work. When you got human resources, the results. I know that I'm sort of probably talking to a lot of folks who have seen this data before, so I won't spend much time on it. But it's not just union contracts too. It's non-union contracts, that go away as well. Employment contracts disappear because human resource departments disappear. And of course, the impact on wages, which is really the second point that I want to mention, that Aronowitz and DeFazio dig into a bit. The flattening of wages as a result of these new employment standards. Certainly, it's you can see the data on it, but you could also see it on the factory floors too. Most of the time, it's minimum wage for these temps, and the agencies get about the same, which makes them it's a pretty lucrative business to step into running one of these agencies. So yeah, it's had an incredible impact both on the wages of workers, but also on the profitability of the corporations that own the agencies. So I'm running out of time here. Let me just quickly show you. These are billions, these numbers. These are some of the big players in the industry. And you should know, because you might be wondering, these are all parent companies of many different brands of agencies. And I should note, because people use the word gig economy today, but these are also the parent companies of many companies that are considered, gig work. So, the language change, and actually that language change was driven by the industry. I really think that's an important point to make, because temp work became criticized by a number of scholars. And, this is an old thing, right? A little name change to sort of distract the criticism. And here, just to sort of wrap things up, this is an important point that I saw on factory floors everywhere. Temps become the levers of profit controlling, right? You think about the sorts of ways you can see a decline in 2020 when the pandemic hit. Certainly, yeah, when the machines shut down and people aren't eating and aren't consuming and aren't shopping, you just send the workers home. There's no cost. There's no cost to send them home. They're not on your payroll, right? There's no cost to the temp agencies either. They're on their payroll, but as you know, they're all 1099 workers. They're independent contractors, and so there's no cost to them either. And so it's really a way of controlling the the ebbs and flows of profit and loss. Lessons learned in the 70s. These are some of the, the gig temp agencies. I call them, the thing is, the big difference is, right, that for 300 years, the temp agency had a physical location. Now it's here. This is where workers wait. They wait on an app on their phone. And I was going to share with you the Honolulu site, because you can just look at it. The new employment agencies are apps that workers sign into on their phones, and then they get dispatched from their phones. So all of that real estate space, that one picture I showed you of a temp agency, they had 880 locations, physical locations, brick and mortar locations across the United States. I think they're down to about 240, but they still employ the same number of workers through the app. And as others have alluded to already, that's a real game changer. So I'll stop there, and we can get into some of the solutions that they framed for us, Aronowitz and DeFazio, and maybe talk about how the NLRB really hasn't done much about this.
Thank you, David. All right. Well, we definitely want to come back to solutions and to, in this moment, where do we see the kind of institutional configurations and innovation that can bring about the kind of values that Stanley, those of us who have worked with them, I'd like to say the labor movement, but I don't know if I can say the labor movement is on the same page entirely on this, given a lot of different conversations today. And then there's the role of universities, there's the role of government. And I think that the energy sector, maybe kind of to loop it back a little bit and to kind of throw things back to Rick and Patricia, one of the projects that I've really been working on, both in terms of research and politically over the last 3 or 4 years, is with the green transition in energy with respect to New York State. And there's a group of actors, and there was a big meeting this week there's a coalition in New York State that got legislation passed called the Climate Leadership and Protection Act. And this is setting renewable energy goals in New York City to reduce pollution, to reduce emissions, and also to transfer 40% of the funds to environmental justice communities. And so it's one thing to pass the laws. It's another thing to have the institutions there that can actually deliver on those in ways that empower communities and deliver on those goals. And one big debate is the role of the public sector, right? And do utilities need to be made public in order to do this. And so there's other groups called the Public Power Campaign. There's several of these in various states that are looking to make Con Ed into a public utility. And I'm involved with the campaign in Long Island to make our local power authority, which is, we have a weird hybrid model of this Long Island Power Authority, which contracts out to a private utility. So I think one thing that I'm getting at in a kind of trying to make it tangible to the moment, but kind of loop it back to Rick and to Patricia is, what about public science, right? Like if we think about the ways in which science has failed us, there's methodological aims, there's the domination of nature, there are these grand themes. But what are some of the institutional configurations look like to make science, and I don't even know what people want to call it these days. Is it a working class science? Is it public science? Is it a liberatory science? Is it sustainable science? I don't know. But I mean, Rick, let me throw it back to you just for thoughts about, any aspect of this question that you want to grab onto.
Okay. Well, it's interesting that you bring that up, because one of the things that I thought about listening to Patricia and David is the question of public science and what's sometimes called citizen science, but I don't think that's really a good term for it, which I've actually now incorporated into several of my courses as the type of project that to encourage students to go out. And yes, sometimes it's using an app like iNaturalist, but that app allows for serious contributions to determining issues of biodiversity that anyone can contribute to, and also scientists and others can draw a lot of data from. So around those things, and there are a couple of other things too, around groups like that, there's like a skyrocketing number of people who are involved in that, which you see scientists coming again and using that data, but the enthusiasm is really coming from the public itself. And I think because the public wants to be engaged in these things, because of that loss of any control really over these processes, you can see the technology going way beyond you. You can have these, you can see discussions where science is used for control, but also where science is also denigrated by people who would like to exercise other forms of control, out there too. So in some ways I kind of see, well, it's lucky that we have the technology now, but I can see public science as a reaction to that, which at the same time is going back to the old science in a way, that though it was mostly white guys who had money, but not always actually, where scientists weren't professionals. They didn't even call themselves scientists. They called themselves natural historians or natural philosophers, or just people who ambled about, collecting things. So there always seems to be this reservoir of reaction against that dominating, version of science. But at the same time, the dominating version of science is so incredibly powerful, and which, it may be partly the pandemic and what we see going on with climate has also contributed to people reacting to their sort of, I won't say naive, but an idea of science. Well, of course, we can both just solve these things, and there are people who know what they're doing who are working on those things, so I don't have to really do anything about it. I can go about
Right.
business. Yeah.
No, that's perfect. Thanks, Rick. And so, Patricia, let me throw it to you. So when you see science now, and you mentioned how you also think it's different from the moment in the 90s when a lot of this work was being done, how do you see it as different, or any of these other things?
Breathing. I want to answer it two ways. My own work more recently is about algorithms and calculation and computation, and how such things as global warming, or more specifically climate change, are really speculative objects that depend on ever-changing calculations, ever-changing metrics, a feedback loop, as we saw with the pandemic as well, what numbers were about and how we were engaged by them. I'm saying that because I actually think understanding these things scientifically is really difficult. And so as we face a situation of our particular United States of America, where people actually are not believing science, right? I mean, and if we once under the tutelage of Stanley Aronowitz argued for facts aren't just facts, that they're really productions, that, you know where I'm going. That is now sort of being lived in ways we had never imagined it would be. And it really takes quite a bit, I think, for us to start thinking it's a great question. What should be our stand about science? And I think as David was suggesting, sort of passionately, thank you, David, that the connection of, and as I mentioned, and as Stanley taught me, because it wasn't just assumed, as we would today, that all science is going to be science technology, that it's always going to be applied. It's always going to be capital invested, which can either mean, the end of human life as we know it, not working, not eating, and the end of our actual environment as well, the destruction of it, which, we all believe in. It's interesting to me what it would mean to teach people the complexity of some of the issues so that they're still find ways to act and to find agency in it. Because I don't think it's simply this is the facts and this is what's true, which as much as we'd like to say. So I want to end by saying that as you know, some of you may know, that for the last 9 years, I've been a psychoanalyst. And this is in honor of Ellen Willis, who I also met through Stanley, and her interest in psychoanalysis. I assume Lynn is still out there somewhere, Lynn. That I've been asked to teach for the first time in 2 institutes that train psychoanalysts a course on culture and politics. Not culture and politics from some psychoanalytic perspective. I mean, not that you wouldn't do it that way, but really culture and politics, because analysts actually don't know a great deal. I mean, there's so many people who don't know a great deal, but they're one group that don't know a great deal. And they see lots and lots of people. They work with lots and lots of people who have lost their jobs. They work with people dealing with dominations, abuses of all kinds. And that would be one place to start teaching something about the psyche and the social, which, Ellen, of course, but Stanley too. Stanley's interest in psyche was a very big connection between me and him. What is going on internally for individuals with these shifts in political economy. So teaching analysts just what is the political economy of the day, not to mention, systemic racism. Many institutions that you're asking about, Michael, are not just dominated still by men, but by white men and white women. Psychoanalysis almost completely white. And so we have a lot of issues to raise in direct services, like psychoanalysis, a pretty sophisticated, well, I take that back, a pretty narrow one, although lots and lots of people, but think of social work. How are we helping people that are in direct services, as well as workers, but the people that service workers in lots of ways and their problems? What is science? What is technology? How it is integral to everything that people do? Because I don't think everyone believes that it is, although because of the phone you raise, we have a better chance of explaining to people that they're tied into technology and social media. And
well, yeah, and I think that's what a definite flip, right? From the 90s, where there was a lot of rejection of technology, but science is on the rise, to now where everybody accepts technology for everything. And then there's the challenge of science. And I want to go to David in a second, but Patricia, I just want to respond on 2 things.
Yeah.
And one is, I in the work that I do around Jamaica Bay with all the climate scientists, and, we're working with communities around the Bay. And Jamaica Bay, like a lot of the United States, is very segregated. And the Black communities tend to be on the north side of the Bay, from Canarsie over into what's called Eastern Queens, around the airport. And then there's, very much all white communities in the middle of the Bay and then out Breezy Point. And all those communities want the scientists to do things for them.
Yes.
It's fascinating. And they say, okay, we have our agenda, right? And it's fascinating because a lot of them are very suave about it, because it's not like they think the scientists are going to solve anything, but they know they need the knowledge for certain things. And it might be for legal reasons or water quality reasons, or, and they want understandings that scientists are supposed to have and do have in certain ways. But none of them think the science is the final arbiter of the question.
Yeah,
and the Eastern Queens Alliance thinks that they are, and the folks in Broad Channel thinks that they are, and the folks, and so, and they're right, right?
Yeah.
That are, and in some sense they should be. I mean, that's what the governance situation looks like. Now, again, there's a lot more to be said there, but I just want to throw that. I mean, David, I want to throw it to you. I mean, you ended with the gig economy and these numbers. I'm thinking essential workers, right? Whatever happened to that category? We got the Great Resignation happening. Where do you see some of the possibilities here? And there's also been some audience questions on this topic, David.
Okay, good. Yeah, let me just say that I went to an interesting conference recently that is hosted by the American Staffing Association. And it was as if I was at a conference for, science and technology, because, you have station after station after station after station that is offering to cater their recent development in how to track workers. I've got a better app to do that than the one you're using. And so you have all these app developers, who want to host the sites for these waiting rooms, these automated waiting rooms, these digitized and, waiting rooms, security, automated security systems, statistical, software programs.
Yeah.
It was incredible. These are just, businesses that are catering to the interests of what is now $1 trillion industry. And in terms of profit.
Yeah.
And it's just amazing. So solutions. I mean, boy, Michael, it's hard to know where to begin. But I will say that I take some lessons from history on this. The building trades found a way to sort of get rid of these sorts of agencies at one time in history. Through hiring halls, but we see could hiring halls have their own apps? Yeah, of course, they can do the same thing. I don't know, folks, the building trades seem intimidated by the Taft-Hartley Act and its sort of, suggestion that it's only the building trades that could have hiring halls, right? That a union shop is a union shop and this sort of thing. I just think there's ways around that. I mean, I've looked at that policy very closely. I think there's plenty of ways around it.
Well, David, I think one other way of, there are these very alternative frameworks, right? Like guaranteed income, right? And DeFazio,
Sure.
And it was interesting because that conversation was different in the 90s. And of course we had presidential candidates and mayoral candidates, I might even say his name, bring it up. And there's robust versions of it. And then there's really, crap versions of it, right?
Sure.
And then there's the job guarantee, right? And the job guarantee has been re-energized. And then you're seeing it in certain level. And I'm wondering, so those are super big picture responses. There's also, smaller efforts that you might look at or be interesting. But I don't know, do either of those options is the job? I mean, Billy, right? Billy, yeah. I mean, the job.
It's the solution in the job is, it's the solution in the Jobless Future. It's the guaranteed, what they call the minimum income, basic income.
Right.
And it has to be because, even with hiring, even if the building trades got into, hiring hall apps where, they could send out union labor, you still have the problem of, of insecure work. And if we're going to live in a world where we're all sort of insecure workers, we need a guaranteed income to supplement our not only our livelihoods but also our other interests, right? Other interests that could be work. So if you haven't, for the audience, if you haven't read that bit in the Jobless Future, it's certainly worth a visit.
No, thank you. That is an excellent reminder. I'm sorry, Rick or Patricia, did you want to respond on this?
I thought David was starting to say, besides everything else everyone is saying, which I'm with, there's some way that I think we have to think, though, what the intervention is for social media, for the apps, for the algorithm. I don't see them exactly going away. And so what is our intervention there? What is our creativity there? And someone mentioned, I forget, it was you, Mike. You know, I also learned from Stanley and have had great experiences of working in groups, you know, thinking in groups, writing in groups, mostly with students who I loved so much. You know, I think we need a lot of group thinking because this is difficult stuff. So I'm interested in that kind of an intervention as both political, economic, but also cultural, you know, cultural psychic. Because Stanley did the gamut.
Yeah, no, I think on the platforms, and again, think about it.
Yeah.
In 95, there's no big five.
Nothing.
There's no Facebook, there's no Google, there's no Apple. There, you know, I mean, Apple's in a different version at that point. But you know what I mean? Like, think how many.
I
Think
know.
how it's changed. And there are, you know, on the sort of big proposals on that front, or there's some who just think there should be a pub. You know, I think Stanley even joked, right, with Nona about taking over Amazon. Just make Amazon a public company or part of the government. They have such great supply chains. You know, why not just utilize them? I'm not saying I agree with that or not. But there is some who call for making it public. There's also different cooperative models. There's, you know, the platform cooperativism, which is a really growing movement field. Some folks in New York, some folks across the world, part of that. And that also intersects with some of David's folks on the gig economy. You've seen more of those groups, I think. You know, there's the Drivers Co-op in New York City now. Got to mention the Drivers Co-op. There's others in Europe, in France, especially with delivery workers. You know, again, kind of what David was saying before, it still doesn't make you not precarious. You know what I mean? It's got a certain kind of leverage to it. You know, but Rick, I'm sorry. Did you want to on this or something want to weigh in on?
No, I agree with everything everyone said. I think you know, and thinking about social media, one of the things that struck me, and in the past few years, I've actually, you know, I started out as a with an ecology BA, so then I come to sociology later on, and it's interesting, sort of, it tags along with this change in the attitudes about science. I kind of rejected that stuff. Now I've gone pretty much back into environmental studies, and I'm looking at soundscape ecology a lot. And one thing I've noticed in terms of the use of social media and in the terms of the use of apps is the number of wildlife cameras that are available, that are online, and that one, you can hear what's going on live in different parts of the world and see, but also how many people are actually in the chat having these conversations with each other about what they're seeing. So they're not going to the Animal Planet or something like that. They're looking at a live feed of a bird feeder somewhere, and they're helping each other identify species. They're talking about these things. So like, I see like two sides of this, you know, of how the technology is working here and that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and I think that, you know, and I'm going to mention Shoshana Zuboff. I don't know if people, the Surveillance Capitalism book, which is a bit infamous in our political camps, because it's not really about surveillance and it's not really about capitalism, but that notwithstanding. But she makes a great fundamental point. That is, the phone's not spying on you. The business model's spying on you. Now, she doesn't want to say capitalism. I mean, she does, but you know what I mean? Like, there's nothing that tells the phone wasn't designed to, you know, go and take all your privacy away and sell it to other people. That's a group of humans with a particular understanding of monetization and so on, right? That are doing that. So what Rick is saying is like, there seems to be all these opportunities for using these technologies in ways that obviously contribute to the public good, especially in ecology. There's all kinds of data gathering where communities can be empowered. I mean, look at Flint, Michigan, right?
Yeah.
Flint, Michigan couldn't get a government scientist to come do an independent study for them. They had to go find somebody at another university. Like, how is that possible these days? Well, we can't, with all the technologies available, they're not deployable by community-based organizations. And that just would be obviously, right, have such immediate benefits. David, I'm sorry.
No.
Oh, sorry. So I think that On this front, as Rick is mentioning, and it is interesting, it's kind of a flip of the original naturalist version, which is the aristocratic, patriarchal, racist, white supremacy. But and EJ groups, environmental justice groups across the world do this, and they leverage that, and it gets them, into a certain kind of position of power to some extent. Now, more, obviously, much more has been done, but we can see more glimpses of it. Just look at the questions too to make sure I didn't mean.
I just want to, while we're looking, we should go to the questions, but Rick was saying something about reflecting back on your own critique. Like I was thinking, yes, when Stanley was in support of environmentalism and taught us, all the Marxists that were absolutely against it, it was about distribution of capital and nothing else. But maybe we're not fast enough with our criticisms. I admired Stanley for his speed. People thought thoughts about it, but, that it was a little messy or something, but he stayed with the world. I think it's a demand that is very rarely met by critics as well as scholars get into their thing and don't stay with language in the world and for the world. So that involves us now with social media in a sense, and how to be there. And how to think, I was thinking quickly that I was in a group for a long time on cryptocurrency and blockchain for the left. And now look where it is. We have to be faster on what we're thinking about.
Absolutely.
No, go ahead, David.
Yeah, I'll just add, because I think this is an important point to make, just the $1 trillion industry that I just discussed, the gig industry, the temporary help industry.
Right.
My union offers me a retirement plan that is heavily invested in that industry.
Right.
And so are most other, if you're a part of TIA craft, you are too, and so are most, and so are most of these, diversified investment firms, right? So we've got, here's a project for somebody out there. Why don't we have, ethically sound labor investment portfolios? Why isn't the labor movement making sure that labor members are investing their dollars in that sort of portfolio? So, we've got these socially responsible investment portfolios that are starting to catch on, but they're almost always environmentally focused, or they just sort of cover the gamut of, of conservative and liberal agendas. And, but none of them focus on labor, because, and you have to sort of wonder why, but, so many investors are paying attention to what company is shifting out of full-time workers or shifting to robots, because they know that's a good place to invest their dollars. And us too, like labor's doing that too. It's so frustrating.
And let's note that in the pictures you showed, almost all those workers were Black, or at least that's how they, and that, the racism that is not easily invested, the anti-racism that's not invested in by labor, has a long story.
Absolutely.
I think, on David, to answer your question, as we got to say, the Professional Staff Congress, the faculty and staff union here at Cuny, and I am on the environmental justice working group for the union, and we're having a conference on December 10th, by the way, from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Peggy Shepard, one of the leading folks in the environmental justice movement in the United States from WEAC, she's our keynote speaker. But we're going to be talking about setting a climate justice agenda at Cuny, because with the infrastructure bill passed, there will be some monies coming down at Cuny, and we have to make sure that they're used for the right thing, right? And by the way, I got to say about Stanley, one of the best things I ever learned for Stanley, I remember, it's one of those things you remember it, I'm sitting in the office, and we're talking about, the Zapatistas, what's happening, it's 95, 96. And I said, I know all these people going to Chiapas, and he goes, why are you giving me that look? And he goes, you want to go? And I'm like, yeah. He goes, you can do politics right here, right? And I was like, what do you mean? He goes, in your university. And I was like, you know what I mean? Like, I was like, wow. He's like, it's the city university. Like, it's supposed to be for us. And it really shook me. I was like, wow, you could do. And of course, Stanley, that was part of his core, right? And I thought other folks, including Michelle Fine, would really hit on this so wonderfully. He can always be not Sassoon, but always be in there, doing the programs. But I got to say, and I don't know if I was subsumed or not, but I got asked to be on the climate task force for the AFT, right, for the American Federation of Teachers, which if you add up all the pension funds and all the investments, it's like they have like $1 trillion. I'm not even joking. Like it's something completely mind-blowing. And this came up because as we're trying to divest from big oil and gas, and there was a unit there, and to their credit, they're like, yo, there is this whole gig economy thing that is so blown up that we really need to think about moving the dollars out of that. So I think there is some intention. But what's missing, David, are the vehicles at the investor level, because the union, the fund can't directly, it needs an intermediary. And that's where we don't have our people. We need to get our people somehow creating these funds that have the truly, empowering, not just ethical, right, but and the empowering investment funds. And there's some folks in the economic democracy frame who are working on this, but we desperately need it because ironically we have the money, right? And that goes back to anti-capitalism 101. Get control over the surplus. If we don't get control of the surplus, we're not getting anywhere. So I think we've gone through all the almost all the questions. We did go through all the questions. I kept bringing them in, and I think Greg Mancios is going to return to close the program in a minute or so. So I'm going to thank the panel. Great to see everybody. Thank the audience, thank the whole day. Michael Pelias and all the folks at Cuny SLU, fantastic work, Michael Alon, so on. But I'm sure Greg will bring this up. So Greg, whenever you're ready, we are absolutely welcome to join us. And as we close things out.
Thank you to this last panel. And I have to say, what a wonderful day this has been. What a wonderful tribute to our dear friend Stanley. Brother Cornell, thank you not only for presenting this morning, but for sticking with us throughout the day. Thank you to all our panelists who presented this morning and this afternoon. It's been a long day, so I don't want to keep us any longer. Stanley, we miss you, but we will all carry on. Thank you.